Welcome back to Whispers of Wisdom, a channel where great books don't just get explained, they come alive. Here, we journey through timeless texts slowly, deeply, and honestly, uncovering the ideas that challenge how we think, live, and become. In this video, we reach one of the most powerful turning points in Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a work divided into 4 philosophical parts, each descending deeper into the meaning of existence, self-overcoming, and affirmation. This is our 11th video in the playlist, where we explore Part 3, chapters 53 through 60, the most intense, transformative, and demanding chapters of the entire book. Here, Zarathustra returns home into solitude, confronts morality itself, wrestles with the weight of seriousness, rewrites old and new values, survives the terrifying idea of eternal recurrence, experiences great longing, learns to dance with life, and finally seals his unconditional yes to existence. These chapters don't comfort you, they confront you. They ask a single, terrifying question. Could you love your life so completely that you would choose it again, exactly as it is, forever? Stay with me, because this is not just philosophy, it's a test of how deeply you can say yes to life. Chapter 53, The Return Home. Zarathustra now speaks of the return home. Yet this home is not a place of walls, familiarity, or human warmth, but a return into the deepest, solitude, where one belongs most truthfully to oneself. And the chapter unfolds as a quiet affirmation that exile was never exile at all, but preparation. After wandering among men, visions, temptations, betrayals, and inner storms, Zarathustra feels the pull back to his cave, not as escape, but as necessity. Because only in solitude can the noise of the world settle enough for one's own voice to be heard again. He reflects that those who truly create must periodically withdraw, not because they despise others, but because creation requires silence, digestion, and distance from applause and accusation alike. Zarathustra recognizes that every encounter with others leaves traces, expectations, and distortions behind, and that without returning home, the self risks becoming fragmented, reactive, and diluted. In his cave, Zarathustra feels both relief and responsibility, because solitude reveals not only peace, but also unresolved questions, unfinished transformations, and the weight of one's own becoming. He speaks of how many fear returning home because they fear facing themselves without distractions, preferring constant movement, noise, or service to others rather than the confrontation with their own depths. Zarathustra embraces this confrontation, knowing that avoidance is the true betrayal of the path. He reflects that home is not comfort, but alignment, the place where one's thoughts, instincts, and values no longer clash, where one can measure how far one has truly come. Zarathustra listens to the echoes of his earlier teachings and examines them without mercy, testing whether they still live within him or have hardened into doctrine. He understands that every teacher must eventually become their own student again, or else turn into a statue worshipped by others, but empty within. In solitude, Zarathustra feels the heaviness of what still remains to be overcome. Yet he also senses a renewed strength, because he is no longer entangled in the reactions of others. He affirms that returning home is not regression, but renewal, not withdrawal, but preparation for higher speech and deeper affirmation. The cave becomes a womb of thought, a place where old skins are shed and new visions gather form. Zarathustra accepts that those who misunderstand his retreat will call it weakness, failure, or abandonment. Yet he no longer seeks their approval. He teaches that the strongest individuals are those who can be alone without bitterness, and among others without losing themselves. As the chapter closes, Zarathustra settles into his solitude with calm resolve, knowing that this return home is a turning inward before a greater outward affirmation, and that only those who can return to themselves can truly return to the world bearing something new. Chapter 54. The Three Evil Things. Zarathustra now speaks of what humanity has long called evil, and he does so not with condemnation, but with fearless curiosity, because this chapter is about tearing away moral labels and looking directly at the raw forces beneath them. He names the three evil things that society has been taught to fear, suppress, and condemn: sensuality, the lust for power, and selfishness. And immediately he overturns the inherited moral judgment by asking not whether these forces are sinful, but whether they are life-denying or life-affirming. Zarathustra reminds us that morality has often been written by the weary, the resentful, and the weak, those who feared strength because they could not wield it, and so they branded natural drives as evil in order to tame them. He begins with sensuality, which has been portrayed as corruption and temptation. Yet Zarathustra sees in it a deep yes to life, the body's wisdom expressing joy, connection, creativity, and intensity. He acknowledges that sensuality can become destructive when denied, repressed, or poisoned by guilt, turning into obsession or shame. But when affirmed consciously, it becomes a source of vitality and gratitude for existence itself. Zarathustra speaks of how religions and moral systems that despise the body ultimately despise life, because they fracture the human being into spirit and flesh, turning natural joy into moral debt. He insists that the body is not a prison for the soul, but its origin, its instrument, and its truth-teller. He then turns to the lust for power, which has been demonized as tyranny, domination, and cruelty. Yet Zarathustra reveals it as the fundamental drive of life itself, the urge to grow, shape, overcome, and express strength. He clarifies that this power is not merely political or physical domination over others, but first and foremost power over oneself, over chaos, over fear, over stagnation. He explains that when the lust for power is denied, it does not disappear, but mutates into manipulation, moralism, passive aggression, and hidden control, making denied power far more dangerous than openly affirmed strength. Zarathustra praises those who dare to desire power openly and honestly, because only then can it be refined, disciplined, and transformed into creation rather than oppression. He condemns not power itself, but the hypocrisy of those who secretly crave influence, while preaching humility as a weapon against the strong. Finally, Zarathustra speaks of selfishness, perhaps the most hated of all virtues, and exposes how it has been misrepresented as greed, cruelty, and indifference. He argues that healthy selfishness is the foundation of any genuine giving, because one who does not value themselves has nothing real to offer. Zarathustra distinguishes between small selfishness, which hoards and fears loss, and great selfishness, which overflows because it is rooted in abundance, self-respect, and clarity of purpose. He observes that moral systems that glorify self-sacrifice often produce resentment, dependency, and spiritual exhaustion, while those who honor themselves deeply are capable of generosity without martyrdom. Zarathustra does not encourage indulgence without awareness. Instead, he calls for mastery, saying that these so-called evils must be owned, shaped, and elevated rather than suppressed or denied. He teaches that virtue is not the absence of strong drives, but their transformation into higher forms of expression. Sensuality becomes celebration, power becomes creativity, selfishness becomes self-responsibility. Zarathustra challenges the listener to examine their own morality and ask whether it was chosen consciously or inherited from fear-based traditions that sought safety over greatness. As the chapter closes, Zarathustra declares that what humanity has long called evil may in fact be misunderstood allies of life, and that the true danger lies not in these forces themselves, but in their repression, distortion, and denial. He leaves us with the unsettling truth that growth demands courage not only to reject false values, but to reclaim the forbidden energies within ourselves and transform them into instruments of becoming. Chapter 55, The Spirit of Gravity. Zarathustra now confronts what he calls the spirit of gravity, and this chapter is one of the most psychologically revealing and existentially important passages in all of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, because here Nietzsche names the invisible weight that presses down on human life, creativity, joy, and becoming without ever announcing itself openly. The spirit of gravity is not merely sadness or pessimism. It is the internalized force of seriousness, guilt, moral heaviness, inherited obligation, and fear of lightness that teaches human beings to walk bent, to think cautiously, and to mistrust joy. Zarathustra speaks of this spirit as his oldest enemy because it does not attack with violence, but with respectability, tradition, reasonableness, and moral authority. It whispers that laughter is shallow, that dancing is childish, that play is irresponsible, and that life must be justified by suffering in order to be meaningful. Zarathustra understands that this spirit is deeply rooted in religious morality, social norms, and even philosophical systems that glorify depth only when it is heavy, painful, and solemn. He sees how people learn to take pride in their burdens, wearing seriousness like a badge of honor, believing that heaviness equals wisdom, and that lightness equals ignorance. Zarathustra refuses this equation entirely, He declares that he learned to walk only when he learned to dance, meaning that true strength is not found in endurance alone, but in the ability to move freely, joyfully, and creatively, even in the face of suffering. The spirit of gravity hates dancing because dancing symbolizes mastery over weight, rhythm over rigidity, affirmation over resignation. Zarathustra mocks this spirit not with bitterness, but with laughter, because laughter disarms gravity more effectively than resistance. He reveals that the spirit of gravity feeds on guilt, especially inherited guilt, the belief that existence itself is a debt that must be repaid through obedience, humility, and self-denial. Zarathustra rejects this entirely, proclaiming that life owes no apology for existing and requires no external justification beyond itself. He speaks of how morality often teaches people to feel heavy for simply being alive, for desiring, for enjoying, for standing out, and how this heaviness slowly erodes vitality until people confuse exhaustion with virtue. Zarathustra does not deny suffering. Instead, he refuses to sanctify it. He insists that suffering does not automatically ennoble, and that joy is not a moral failure. The spirit of gravity tries to make humans ashamed of their strength, suspicious of happiness, and fearful of their own potential, because lightness threatens all systems built on control. Zarathustra describes how even thinkers and scholars fall prey to this spirit, mistaking complexity for depth and seriousness for intelligence, while dismissing clarity, laughter, and simplicity as naive. He challenges this bias directly, arguing that what is truly profound often appears light because it has been mastered, while what is truly shallow often hides behind layers of heaviness to avoid exposure. Zarathustra teaches that overcoming the spirit of gravity is not about rejecting responsibility, but about transforming it, carrying weight without being crushed by it, choosing one's burdens rather than inheriting them blindly. He speaks of children as sacred symbols in this struggle, because children embody play, experimentation, and fearless engagement with life before gravity teaches them shame and restraint. Zarathustra longs for a humanity that can think deeply without despair, create without guilt, and live intensely without apology. He declares that only those who learn to laugh at themselves can truly overcome themselves, because self-seriousness is the final refute of fear. In this chapter, Zarathustra also connects gravity to time itself, showing how humans feel crushed by past mistakes and future anxieties, unable to dance in the present moment. He insists that affirmation of life requires learning to say yes to existence as a whole, including its pain, rather than dragging every moment beneath the weight of regret or dread. The spirit of gravity resists this affirmation fiercely, because a dancing humanity cannot be ruled easily, cannot be shamed into obedience, and cannot be pacified by false ideals. As Zarathustra speaks, he models a new posture toward existence, upright, playful, daring, experimental. He does not promise happiness, but he promises vitality, movement, and creative fire. He teaches that the goal is not to become weightless, but to become strong enough to carry weight lightly, turning burden into rhythm and necessity into style. By the end of the chapter, Zarathustra has not destroyed the spirit of gravity entirely, because it can never be fully eliminated, but he has mastered it, transformed it from tyrant into sparring partner. He leaves us with the unsettling and liberating challenge to examine our own seriousness and ask whether it serves life or suppresses it, whether our heaviness is chosen or inherited, and whether we are truly walking or merely enduring. This chapter stands as a call to reclaim joy as a form of strength, laughter as a form of wisdom, and dancing as the ultimate symbol of a life that has learned not just to survive existence, but to affirm it fully, courageously, and creatively. Chapter 56, Old and New Tables. Zarathustra now arrives at one of the most monumental chapters in all of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a chapter that does not merely comment on morality, but rewrites the logic by which values themselves are born. And this is why Old and New Tables feels less like a speech and more like a declaration of independence for the human spirit. Zarathustra speaks here as a lawgiver, but not in the old sense of commandments descending from heaven. Instead, he speaks as one who has suffered, wandered, doubted, overcome, and earned the right to create values from lived experience. The old tables represent inherited moral laws, religious commandments, cultural norms, unquestioned ideals that were carved in stone by past generations under conditions of fear, survival, resentment, and obedience. These tables once served life, Zarathustra admits, but they have grown brittle, oppressive, and hostile to higher forms of becoming. The tragedy, he observes, is that humanity continues to worship these tables long after the conditions that created them have vanished, mistaking obedience for virtue and tradition for truth. Zarathustra does not call the old values evil, he calls them outgrown. And this distinction is crucial, because life does not negate what came before, it surpasses it. He explains that every moral system is an interpretation of life, not life itself, and that treating values as eternal truths freezes existence into dogma. Zarathustra announces that the greatest danger facing humanity is not chaos, but stagnation, the inability to create new values when old ones begin to suffocate growth. He speaks of how old moralities glorified humility, obedience, patience, and self-denial, because these qualities were necessary for survival under harsh conditions. Yet, when carried forward unchanged, they become tools of suppression, rewarding weakness and punishing strength. Zarathustra exposes how moral language often disguises fear, calling the inability to act goodness, the refusal to desire purity, and exhaustion, peace. He challenges the listener to ask whether their values arise from abundance or scarcity, from strength or from defense. At this point, Zarathustra introduces the new tables, but he does not present them as universal commandments. Instead, he presents them as examples of value creation, emphasizing that each higher individual must eventually carve their own. The new values are rooted in affirmation rather than negation, in creativity rather than obedience, in responsibility rather than guilt. Zarathustra praises courage, not merely physical bravery, but the courage to stand alone, to risk misunderstanding, and to live without metaphysical guarantees. He honors honesty, not as moral purity, but as loyalty to one's own experience, even when it contradicts tradition. He elevates self-overcoming as the highest virtue, declaring that greatness lies not in defeating others, but in continually surpassing one's former self. Zarathustra also speaks of love, but not sentimental love. He speaks of a love that wants growth, distance, and challenge, rather than comfort and possession. He insists that a true friend is one who pushes you toward your highest potential, not one who shelters you from becoming uncomfortable. The new tables reject resentment, revenge, and moralizing, because these attitudes tie the soul to the past and drain creative energy. Instead, Zarathustra calls for gratitude toward existence itself, even toward suffering, because suffering becomes meaningful when it is transformed rather than denied. Zarathustra's vision here is radical because it places the responsibility for meaning directly on the individual. There is no external authority left to blame, no divine command to hide behind, no universal moral code to excuse cowardice. Freedom, he reminds us, is not light, it is heavy, because it demands authorship. Many fear this freedom, he says, and cling to old tables not because they are true, but because they are familiar. Zarathustra understands this fear deeply, which is why his tone is not condemning, but demanding. He calls for humanity that can bear the weight of creating values without collapsing into nihilism or returning to obedience. He warns that destroying old values without creating new ones leads to emptiness, cynicism, and despair, a condition far more dangerous than outdated morality. The task, therefore, is not rebellion for its own sake, but creative affirmation, to say yes to life so powerfully that new values emerge organically from strength. Zarathustra connects this process to the image of the child from earlier chapters, the child as creator, player, and innocent beginner, capable of saying a sacred yes after the lion has destroyed the old laws. As the chapter unfolds, Zarathustra acknowledges that his new tables are not final, not eternal, and not meant for everyone. They are stepping stones, provocations, sparks meant to ignite further creation. He explicitly rejects the idea that his words should become a new dogma, warning that even his teachings must one day be overcome. This self-overcoming of one's own philosophy is perhaps the most radical aspect of the chapter, because it refuses the comfort of final answers. Zarathustra teaches that loyalty to life means loyalty to change, even when that change dismantles what one once held sacred. He speaks of future humans, stronger, freer, more playful, who will laugh at today's moral struggles just as today laughs at ancient fears. And this vision is neither utopian nor guaranteed. It is a possibility that must be earned. By the end of Old and New Tables, Zarathustra stands not as a prophet demanding followers, but as a challenger inviting creators. He leaves the listener with an unsettling but empowering realization. That meaning is not discovered, but made. That values are not inherited, but forged. And that the greatest responsibility of freedom is not choosing between good and evil, but deciding what deserves to be called good at all. This chapter marks a summit in Zarathustra's journey, where the philosophy reaches full maturity, not as doctrine, but as a living process of continual self-transcendence. Chapter 57, The Convalescent. Zarathustra now enters the convalescent, one of the most dramatic, frightening, and decisive chapters in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Because here the philosophy stops being speech and becomes ordeal. This chapter is not about teaching others. It is about whether Zarathustra himself can endure the ultimate thought he has carried in silence, the thought of eternal recurrence, the idea that everything that has happened will happen again, endlessly, in exactly the same way, without redemption, without escape, without final meaning beyond repetition. Zarathustra falls ill, not from physical weakness, but from the weight of this realization, because the mind can imagine eternal return easily, but the soul resists it with terror. He lies like one struck down, unable to speak, unable to act, suspended between rejection and affirmation. His animals, the eagle and the serpent, symbolizing pride and wisdom, remain with him, waiting, because this is not a sickness to be cured quickly. It is a crisis that must be lived through. Zarathustra understands that eternal recurrence is not a theory to be debated, but a test of one's relationship to life itself. Can you say yes to existence so completely that you would will its repetition forever, including every pain, mistake, loss, and humiliation? The horror of the thought lies precisely here, not in monotony, but in responsibility. Nothing can be erased, forgiven by time, or compensated later. Every moment becomes infinitely heavy, because it must be lived as if it were to return eternally. Zarathustra realizes that this thought destroys all hope-based morality, all consolation through progress, heaven, or future redemption. It demands a new kind of strength, the strength to love life without conditions. As he convalesces, Zarathustra speaks intermittently, struggling against nausea, despair, and revulsion. He confesses that what disgusted him most was not suffering itself, but the smallness of humanity, the pettiness, resentment, cowardice, and mediocrity that would also recur eternally. The thought that the mean, the cruel, the complacent, and the petty would return endlessly nearly breaks him, because it challenges the hope that humanity will someday be redeemed or surpassed automatically. Zarathustra's sickness is thus a sickness of compassion and judgment combined, a recoil from the totality of existence. Yet this recoil reveals something crucial. Even Zarathustra has not yet fully affirmed life. The chapter shows that becoming the overman is not about superiority to others, but but about conquering one's own disgust, despair, and conditional love for life. His animals remind him that he himself taught eternal recurrence, and that now he must live up to his own teaching. They insist that he must either reject the thought entirely or embrace it without remainder. There is no middle ground. This confrontation is brutal because it exposes every hidden reservation, every secret no one says to existence while pretending to affirm it. Gradually, through suffering, silence, and inner struggle, Zarathustra transforms. His sickness becomes a purification, burning away the last remnants of hope for a different world, a better humanity guaranteed by fate, or a final moral reckoning. What remains is a deeper, harder affirmation, one that does not depend on progress, reward, or escape. Zarathustra begins to recover, not because the thought has become pleasant, but because he has grown strong enough to bear it. He accepts that the eternal return includes not only greatness, but mediocrity, not only joy, but horror, and that loving life means loving it whole. This acceptance is not resignation. It is amor fati, the love of fate, transformed into existential courage. By affirming eternal recurrence, Zarathustra becomes capable of willing his own life exactly as it is, without amendment, without appeal. This moment marks his true rebirth, because only now does he fully embody what he teaches. As the chapter closes, Zarathustra rises again, convalesced, but changed, carrying within him a heavier, yet more liberating strength. He is no longer driven by hope, disgust, or the desire to escape humanity, but by a profound yes to existence itself. The terror of eternal return has become the measure of his affirmation, and in surviving it, Zarathustra stands transformed, not healed back to who he was, but elevated into someone capable of bearing the most demanding thought ever conceived. Chapter 58, The Great Longing. Zarathustra now enters the great longing, a chapter that follows the ordeal of eternal recurrence, not with triumph, but with yearning, because after surviving the most demanding thought imaginable, the soul does not become satisfied. It becomes more awake, more sensitive, and more desirous of what has not yet come into being. This chapter is quieter than the previous one, yet no less intense, because it explores the emotional aftermath of affirmation, the ache that follows acceptance, and the strange sadness that arises when one has said yes to life so completely that one now longs for something higher than survival or endurance. Zarathustra speaks not as a conqueror, but as one who has looked into the deepest abyss and emerged with a longing that is no longer personal, no longer tied to his own happiness, but directed toward the future of humanity itself. He feels an ache for those who are not yet born, for higher forms of existence that may arise only if the present dares to overcome itself. This longing is not hope in the traditional sense, because it carries no guarantees, no promises of fulfillment, and no certainty of success. It is a creative tension, a pull toward possibility that exists precisely because nothing ensures it. Zarathustra recognizes that longing is the price of affirmation, because to love life deeply is to feel its incompleteness more sharply. He reflects that those who cling to comfort, dogma, or final answers do so partly to escape longing, to dull the ache of becoming with certainty and closure. Zarathustra refuses this dulling, even though longing exposes him to vulnerability, sadness, and solitude. In this chapter, Zarathustra distinguishes between small longing and great longing. Small longing desires fulfillment, rest, possession, and resolution. It wants to be satisfied and finished. Great longing, by contrast, desires growth, risk, and continuation. It does not want to be cured, because it is itself a sign of vitality. Zarathustra embraces this great longing as evidence that life is still moving through him, still demanding more than comfort or repetition. He understands that the overman is not a destination to be reached, but a direction toward which longing points, a horizon that keeps receding as one approaches it. This realization prevents Zarathustra from turning his philosophy into dogma or final truth, because longing resists closure and demands ongoing creation. He speaks of how those who lose the capacity for longing often replace it with resentment, cynicism, or nostalgia, clinging to the past because the future feels too uncertain. Zarathustra's longing, however, is forward-facing. It aches not for what was, but for what could be. Zarathustra also reflects on the loneliness of this longing, because it cannot be easily shared or explained. Those who have not endured the ordeal of affirmation mistake longing for dissatisfaction or weakness, urging contentment, gratitude, or acceptance instead. Zarathustra knows that contentment without striving is stagnation, and gratitude without creation is mere politeness toward existence. He insists that to honor life fully is to remain restless in one's creativity, even after saying yes to what is. This tension between acceptance and striving, affirmation and longing, is not a contradiction, but the engine of becoming. Zarathustra experiences moments of sorrow in this chapter, not because life has failed him, but because he loves it enough to want more from it than repetition alone. His longing is thus inseparable from his affirmation of eternal recurrence. Having accepted repetition, he now seeks to transform what repeats through creation and value-making. As the chapter unfolds, Zarathustra's longing becomes almost musical, a rhythm of desire that mirrors the dance imagery throughout the book. He does not long for escape from the world, but for a deeper incarnation within it, a way of living that would justify recurrence through greatness rather than mere endurance. He yearns for companions who can bear this longing without turning it into complaint or ideology. Yet he knows that such companions are rare and cannot be summoned at will. This awareness intensifies his solitude, but does not embitter him, because longing itself keeps him open rather than closed. Zarathustra accepts that longing is the shadow cast by creation, and that to eliminate it would be to extinguish the creative flame itself. By the end of the great longing, Zarathustra stands poised between affirmation and future creation, having survived despair without becoming satisfied, having said yes without falling asleep. The chapter leaves us with the unsettling but invigorating insight that the highest affirmation of life does not lead to peace, but to deeper responsibility. The responsibility to shape what will return, to create values worth repeating, and to live in such a way that one could will its eternal recurrence without regret. Chapter 59, the second dance song. Zarathustra now sings the second dance song. And this chapter is not an argument, not a doctrine, not even a lesson, but a movement of the soul. Because after enduring eternal recurrence and embracing great longing, philosophy must finally become rhythm, music, and dance. Zarathustra speaks to life itself here, personifying it as a feminine force, elusive, playful, dangerous, and irresistibly beautiful. And the tone of the chapter shifts from struggle to flirtation, from confrontation to intimacy. This is not a retreat from seriousness, but its transformation, because dancing is what remains when heaviness has been mastered rather than denied. Zarathustra declares that he loves life, not because it is good, fair, or just, but because it is alive, unpredictable, and overflowing with creative force. He addresses life as one addresses a lover who both wounds and delights, acknowledging that their relationship is not safe, equal, or morally pure, but vibrant and real. Through the dance song, Zarathustra expresses a form of wisdom that cannot be spoken plainly, because it exists in rhythm rather than logic. Zarathustra reflects that many people approach life as a burden to be endured or a problem to be solved, whereas he approaches it as a dance partner, something to move with, respond to, and shape through style rather than control. This metaphor reveals a crucial insight. Mastery over life does not come from domination or withdrawal, but from participation. One must be light enough to follow its rhythms and strong enough to lead when necessary. Zarathustra recalls how the spirit of gravity once tried to chain him to seriousness, guilt, and fear, and how learning to dance was his rebellion against all life-denying forces. Dancing becomes here the ultimate symbol of affirmation, because it unites body and spirit, joy and discipline, freedom and form. He insists that only those who can dance can truly understand his teaching, because dancing requires trust in the moment without guarantees. In this chapter, Zarathustra also addresses the tension between desire and impermanence. He knows that life cannot be possessed, fixed, or secured, and that any attempt to freeze it into moral rules or final truths kills its vitality. His dance is therefore fleeting, momentary, and vulnerable. And this vulnerability is not weakness, but authenticity. Zarathustra contrasts his dance with the rigid postures of those who fear falling, arguing that fear of loss is what keeps most people from fully engaging with existence. He does not ask for protection from suffering. He asks for intensity, rhythm, and depth. Life responds to him playfully, teasing, retreating, and returning, symbolizing how existence rewards courage not with certainty, but with experience. The second dance song also reveals Zarathustra's acceptance of contradiction. He loves life even when it wounds him, even when it repeats pain, even when it denies resolution. This love is no longer conditional, no longer dependent on improvement or redemption. It is a love strong enough to include suffering without demanding compensation. Zarathustra recognizes that this love is rare because it demands a soul that has overcome resentment, hope, and despair alike. Most people either cling to life desperately or reject it bitterly. But Zarathustra dances between these extremes, neither begging nor fleeing. As the chapter closes, the dance does not end in triumph or exhaustion, but in continuation, because dancing has no final goal beyond itself. Zarathustra's wisdom here is embodied rather than explained. To live well is not to arrive at answers, but to develop a style of existence capable of responding creatively to whatever comes. The second dance song thus becomes a culmination of Zarathustra's journey through suffering, solitude, affirmation, and longing, showing that the highest philosophy may ultimately be indistinguishable from art. Chapter 60, The Seven Seals. Zarathustra now speaks the seven seals, the final and most exalted chapter of the third part. And here philosophy no longer argues, teaches, or questions. It sings a final yes. This chapter is the culmination of everything that came before: wandering, solitude, temptation, sickness, recovery, longing, and dance all converge into a single act of affirmation, so complete that nothing is excluded, nothing is amended, nothing is regretted. The seven seals are not commandments or laws, they are vows. Each one a sacred promise Zarathustra makes to existence itself. With every seal, he repeats the phrase, "For I love you, O eternity." And this repetition is deliberate, ritualistic, and transformative, because love for eternity means loving life not as a sequence moving towards salvation or progress, but as an endless return of the same moments, joys, horrors, mistakes, and triumphs. Zarathustra no longer merely accepts eternal recurrence, he wills it. And this willing marks the highest possible affirmation of life. Each seal represents a deep layer of this affirmation, sealing Zarathustra's loyalty to existence at every level: body, soul, suffering, joy, solitude, creativity, and fate. In the first seals, Zarathustra affirms life without seeking justification beyond itself. He rejects all otherworldly hopes, final judgments, and moral compensations, declaring that existence needs no excuse, no redemption, and no higher purpose beyond its own overflowing vitality. This is a radical stance because it removes every metaphysical safety net and leaves only the raw responsibility of saying yes. Zarathustra seals his love for life even in its cruelty, chaos, and indifference, refusing to call existence guilty for not being fair. In doing so, he dismantles centuries of moral resentment that accused life of wrongdoing simply for being what it is. As the seals continue, Zarathustra affirms suffering as inseparable from creation. He does not glorify pain, but he refuses to resent it, understanding that every act of becoming requires destruction, risk, and loss. He declares his willingness to relive not only his victories, but also his failures eternally, because to reject any part of one's life is to fracture the whole. This seal is terrifying in its honesty, because it demands ownership of one's entire existence without appeal to forgiveness, progress, or forgetting. Zarathustra seals his love for his own past, not as nostalgia, but as responsibility. Another seal affirms solitude and distance. Zarathustra declares his love for the path that separates him from the crowd, because only distance allows vision, and only solitude allows creation. He seals his willingness to be misunderstood, rejected, and alone, if that is the price of fidelity to becoming. This seal transforms loneliness from a wound into a badge of strength, not because solitude is pleasant, but because it is necessary for those who create values rather than inherit them. As the seals deepen, Zarathustra affirms joy, not shallow pleasure, but the joy that emerges after overcoming despair. He declares his love for laughter, dancing, and play as expressions of strength rather than escape. This joy does not deny suffering, it grows from it, proving that affirmation is not naivete, but mastery. Zarathustra seals his commitment to lightness as a hard-won achievement, not a default state. One of the final seals affirms the future, not as guaranteed progress, but as open possibility. Zarathustra does not promise that humanity will overcome itself. He only promises to live as if it could. He seals his love for what has not yet been born, for higher forms of life that may arise only if the present dares to create rather than cling. This seal rejects despair without indulging in hope, standing instead in creative tension. In the final seal, Zarathustra unites all previous affirmations into a single cosmic yes. He embraces eternity not as endless time, but as the eternal return of the moment, declaring that he would choose this life again and again, unchanged, forever. This is the ultimate test of affirmation, not whether one can endure existence, but whether one can desire it eternally. The repetition of yes and amen is not religious submission, but joyful consent, a sealing of fate with love rather than obedience. As the chapter closes, there is no conclusion in the traditional sense, because affirmation has no endpoint. Zarathustra stands as one who has said yes without reserve, without condition, without escape. The 7 seals close the third part with a cosmic stillness, not because movement has ended, but because the foundation has been laid for everything that follows. Zarathustra is now fully aligned with his teaching, having survived the deepest trial imaginable and emerged not purified, but affirmed. This chapter leaves us with the most demanding question Nietzsche ever posed. Could you love your life so completely that you would will its eternal return, not corrected, not improved, not redeemed, but exactly as it is. In this question, Zarathustra's journey becomes our own, and the book stops being literature and becomes a mirror. In this video, we walked through Zarathustra's final trial in Part 3, the return into solitude, the reevaluation of so-called evil, the battle against the spirit of gravity, the creation of new values, the collapse and rebirth brought by eternal recurrence, the ache of great longing, the rhythm of the second dance, and finally, the sealing of existence itself in the 7 seals. These chapters reveal that true strength is not hope, not morality, not escape, but affirmation. If this episode resonated with you, I invite you to explore the earlier videos in this playlist, where each part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra is unfolded step by step, building toward this moment. And don't stop here, because in the next video, we enter the 4th and final part, where Zarathustra returns to humanity, encounters higher men, faces misunderstanding, irony, and laughter, and delivers his final, most human teachings. Subscribe to Whispers of Wisdom. Stay with the journey and prepare yourself, because the final part of Zarathustra is not about climbing higher, but about learning how to descend without losing yourself.